The dawn of March 15th, 1944, broke not with the gentle light of the sun, but with the harsh, metallic clamor of an airbase coming to life. For the men of the 381st Bomb Group, stationed at Ridgewell in Essex, England, it was just another day in the long, grinding aerial siege of Europe. There was no fanfare, no sense of historic premonition. There was only the mission. The briefing room was a thick haze of cigarette smoke and the smell of damp wool, filled with the tense, young faces of the B-17 Flying Fortress crews. At the center of this story was one such crew, and at their helm was a 21-year-old pilot from Ohio, First Lieutenant Alex "Rusty" Vogelsang. To them, it was, in the grim parlance of the 8th Air Force, just another maximum effort. The target for the day was Brunswick, Germany, a city deep in the Reich's industrial heartland, a hub for tank production and aviation manufacturing. It was a big B target, heavily defended, known to the air crews as a flak trap. As the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain on the large map, a collective, almost imperceptible groan rippled through the room. The red string marking the flight path stretched ominously deep into Germany, passing through a constellation of known flak batteries and skirting the airfields of the Luftwaffe's deadliest fighter groups. This was not a milk run. This was a journey into the lion's den. The term routine in the 8th Air Force was a grotesque misnomer, a psychological coping mechanism for an undertaking of almost unimaginable violence and risk. A routine mission meant a pre-dawn wake-up in a cold Nissan hut, a breakfast of powdered eggs and greasy bacon that sat heavily in the stomach, the methodical suiting up in layers of electrically heated gear, and a bulky, restrictive flak jacket. It meant the solemn ritual of checking your parachute, your Mae Westlife vest, and the .45 caliber sidearm that felt more like a token gesture than a real weapon. It meant the crew briefing, the nervous jokes, the shared silence in the back of the truck on the way to the hard stand where their aircraft waited. And there she was, the Dakota Queen, a B-17F Flying Fortress. She was not a beautiful machine in the traditional sense, but she was a formidable one, all angular lines and brute strength. Her aluminum skin, still dark in the pre-dawn gloom, was scarred and patched from previous missions. Her nose art, a sultry pin-up girl, seemed a defiant gesture against the grim reality of her purpose. The ground crew moved around her with practiced efficiency, loading 500-pound bombs into her cavernous belly, feeding belts of .50 caliber ammunition into her 10 machine guns, and performing last-minute checks. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel and hot oil. For Rusty and his 9-man crew, the Dakota Queen was more than a machine. She was their home, their weapon, and their only hope of returning to the green fields of England. The crew was a microcosm of America itself, a mix of city boys and farm kids, from the industrial Northeast to the wide-open plains of the Midwest. There was the co-pilot, Lieutenant Ken "Chipper" Miller, a wisecracking kid from Brooklyn who hid his fear behind a constant stream of jokes. There was the navigator, Lieutenant David Carter, a serious, methodical man from Pennsylvania who trusted his sextant and charts more than anything else. And in the plexiglass nose was the bombardier, Lieutenant Frank "Doc" Owens, who would later hold all their lives in his hands during the bomb run. The gunners, the flight engineer, the radio operator, they were all boys pretending to be men, entrusted with a weapon of war that cost more than their entire hometowns. As startup time approached, the ritual began. With a signal from the crew chief, Rusty engaged the first of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. A cloud of blue smoke erupted, followed by a sputter, a cough, and then the deep, thunderous roar that promised both power and vulnerability. One by one, the other engines coughed to life until the aircraft shuddered with a vibration that could be felt in the bones. They taxied out, a long line of silver giants moving in a slow, ponderous procession towards the runway. The noise was deafening, a symphony of raw power that drowned out all thought. Then came the moment of no return. With a green light from the control tower and a final surge of power, the Dakota Queen began her takeoff roll. Laden with bombs and fuel, she felt heavy and sluggish, demanding every ounce of Rusty's skill to keep her straight. The end of the runway rushed towards them, a terrifying precipice. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed they would not make it, and then the weight lifted, the vibration smoothed, and they were airborne. The English countryside unfolded beneath them in a patchwork of green and brown, a deceptively peaceful scene they all hoped to see again. They joined the stream, a vast aerial armada of over 600 bombers, circling over the English Channel to form up into the combat box formation that was their only defense. From his cockpit, Rusty could see them, a breathtaking, terrifying sight. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s stacked in layers, their silver wings glinting in the rising sun. It was a display of immense industrial power, a statement of intent from a nation that had been awakened to war. But as they crossed the enemy coast near the Dutch island of Walcheren, the mood inside the cockpit shifted. The interphone, once filled with Chipper's nervous chatter, fell silent. The routine was over. Below them, the world had turned from the friendly green of England to the cold, hard gray of Fortress Europe. They had entered the hostile skies, and hell was waiting. The crossing of the enemy coastline was a psychological event horizon. The moment the Dutch coast slipped beneath the wings of the Dakota Queen, the world transformed. The serene, pastoral landscape of England was replaced by a geometric patchwork of suspiciously straight canals and flooded fields. German defensive measures against airborne invasion. The air itself seemed to grow colder, heavier. The casual tension that had filled the interphone was now replaced by a sharp, professional silence, broken only by terse, necessary reports. They were in the Krautland, and every man aboard knew the statistics. They knew that the sky ahead was not empty. It was a calculated gauntlet of physics and hatred, designed to tear them from the sky. The first threat was the Luftwaffe. The initial leg of the mission was deceptively quiet, a period of anxious waiting. Then, the radio chatter began. Fighters, 10 o'clock high. The call, sharp and clear, came from a top turret gunner in a group ahead. Almost instantly, the serene blue canvas of the sky was scarred by the contrails of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, diving out of the sun with terrifying speed. The American escort fighters, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, peeled away to engage, turning the sky into a swirling, chaotic dogfight. From his pilot's seat, Rusty Vogelsang could only watch, a spectator in his own life-or-death drama, as the fighters twisted and turned, the bright flashes of their cannons visible even in the daylight. For the gunners aboard the Dakota Queen, this was their moment. The calm was shattered by the deafening, percussive roar of the .50 caliber machine guns. The ball turret gunner, suspended in his plexiglass bubble beneath the fuselage, became the eyes of the ship's underbelly, tracking the sleek, deadly shapes as they raced past. The waist gunners, exposed to the 60 below zero slipstream, swung their heavy weapons in wide arcs, their world reduced to the fleeting image of an enemy fighter in their sights. The air inside the plane filled with the acrid smell of cordite and the sharp, metallic clang of spent shell casings bouncing off the deck. A Focke-Wulf made a head-on pass, its wings sparkling with 20mm cannon fire. Tracers streaked past the cockpit, so close Rusty could feel the heat. "He's coming around again," someone yelled over the interphone. The fortress shuddered as its own guns returned fire, a collective roar of defiance. They fought off the attack, but the price was visible in the sky around them. A B-17 to their left, part of another group, took a direct hit in its bomb bay. For a split second, it seemed to swell, and then it disintegrated in a silent, orange blossom of fire, pieces of wing and fuselage cartwheeling slowly away. No parachutes were seen. It was just gone. The sight was a physical blow to every man who witnessed it, a stark reminder of their own fragile mortality encased in thin aluminum. The interphone was silent for a long moment, the only sound the steady, powerful thrum of the Wright Cyclone engines, a sound that now felt less like power and more like a prayer. But the fighters were only the opening act. As they approached the initial point, IP, the start of the bomb run, the true horror began. The flak started. At first, it was just innocent-looking, puffy black clouds appearing a few miles ahead, like cotton balls, the veterans called them. But these cotton balls were made of steel and high explosives. The German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground had them in their range. As the Dakota Queen began its bomb run, the world outside dissolved into chaos. The flak intensified from a sporadic nuisance into a solid, churning wall of black smoke and shrapnel. This was the party, and everyone was invited. The bomb run was the most terrifying part of the mission. For what felt like an eternity, but was only a few excruciating minutes, the pilot had to fly the aircraft straight and level. No evasive action, no turns, no deviation. The success of the mission, the destruction of the target, depended on a stable platform for the bombardier, Frank Doc Owens, in the nose. The airplane was transformed from a fighting machine into a sitting duck. The sound was unlike anything else. It was not the crack of a rifle or the boom of a cannon. It was a savage, concussive crump that hammered the air. The plane bucked and shuddered as if being struck by a giant's fist. Shrapnel, jagged, red-hot pieces of steel, ripped through the aluminum skin with a sound like handfuls of gravel thrown against a tin roof. A hole the size of a dinner plate appeared in the wing. Another tore through the fuselage near the radio room, letting in a screaming, freezing gale. The air filled with the smell of ozone and burnt metal. Rusty's world narrowed to the instruments in front of him. His hands, clenched on the control yoke, were white-knuckled. He fought to keep the wings level, his eyes fixed on the aircraft ahead, using it as a guide through the inferno. He could hear the strained breathing of his co-pilot, Ken, and the calm, monotone voice of Doc Owens in the nose. Steady, steady, left, left, steady. The fate of the crew, the success of the mission, now rested on the bombardier's skill and the Norden bomb sight he peered through. Then it happened. There was no single, dramatic sound, just a violent, sickening lurch that was different from the near misses. A shell, a dreaded 88 millimeters, had found them. It exploded just below and behind the cockpit. The concussion was physical, a wave of pressure that slammed into the crew. Red warning lights flashed on the instrument panel. The number 3 engine was on fire, a stream of thick, black smoke pouring back over the wing. The number 4 engine was sputtering, its RPMs dropping precipitously. The controls went sloppy in Rusty's hands, the aircraft yawing violently to the right. The interphone erupted in a cacophony of damage reports. Fire in number 3. Hydraulic pressure dropping. We've got a hole in the waist you could drive a jeep through. The Dakota Queen was mortally wounded. The routine mission was over. The fortress was falling. The sky, which had been on fire around them, had now reached inside their own aircraft. The fight for survival had begun. The world inside the Dakota Queen disintegrated from an organized machine of war into a shuddering, screaming tomb. The initial, violent lurch from the flak impact was followed by a deeper, more ominous vibration that resonated through the entire airframe. The fire in number 3 engine was not just smoke. It was a living, breathing beast of orange flame, eagerly consuming the wing root, threatening at any moment to reach the main fuel tank. The number 4 engine had seized entirely, a dead weight dragging the aircraft into a fatal yaw. The once familiar roar of the Wright Cyclones was now a discordant, dying symphony of grinding metal and howling wind. In the cockpit, Rusty Vogelsang's hands were a blur of motion, fighting the controls with every ounce of his strength. He and his co-pilot, Ken, shoved the control columns forward, then pulled back, stomping on the rudder pedals in a desperate, physical argument with gravity and physics. The altimeter was unwinding, a relentless countdown to impact. The struggle was visceral, a battle of muscle and will against the inevitable. "We can't hold her," Ken shouted, his voice strained, the usual wisecracking tone gone, replaced by raw fear. The smell of burning oil and superheated metal filled the cockpit, choking and thick. Through the windshield, the earth below was no longer a distant map. It was a landscape rushing up to meet them, its features growing terrifyingly distinct. The moment of decision arrived with a cold, brutal clarity. The fire was winning. The controls were almost completely unresponsive. To stay with the aircraft was to sign a death warrant for every man on board. Rusty's training, drilled into him through countless hours, cut through the fog of panic. He keyed the interphone, his voice surprisingly steady, a forced calm that was the last gift he could give his crew. "That's it. Prepare to bail out. Bail out. Bail out." The command, the one they had all dreaded and trained for, triggered a final, desperate ritual. In the nose, Bombardier Frank Doc Owens didn't need to be told twice. He pulled the emergency release handle for the nose hatch, watching it vanish into the slipstream with a deafening roar. He offered a frantic, final thumbs up to the pilots he could no longer see, and then he was gone, swallowed by the abyss. Navigator David Carter was right behind him, his charts and calculations now utterly meaningless. In the cockpit, the procedure was a grim, well-rehearsed dance. Rusty set the autopilot, a futile, symbolic gesture to keep the crippled fortress level for just a few more precious seconds. He looked over at Ken, their eyes meeting for a final time. There were no words. A nod. A shared, unthinkable understanding. Ken released his harness, gave a last, desperate pull on the controls, and then clambered out of his seat, heading back through the narrow passage to the forward hatch. Now alone, Rusty's world shrunk to the simple, terrifying act of leaving his post. He unplugged his oxygen and interphone lines, the sudden silence as deafening as the engine's roar had been. He released his seat harness and stood, the force of the dive trying to slam him back into his seat. The wind screaming through the shattered cockpit was a physical force, tearing at his clothes, trying to pluck him from the aircraft. He had to fight his way out, hand over hand, pulling himself toward the yawning emptiness where the nose had been. Then he was at the edge. There was no time for thought, no moment for reflection on his life or his fate. There was only the chaotic, violent maelstrom of the slipstream and the green and brown patchwork of Germany spinning dizzily below. He took a final, gasping breath of the thin, cold air and pushed himself out into the void. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. One moment he was part of a dying machine. The next he was a solitary, helpless object in the sky. The force of the exit slammed into him, tumbling him end over end. The world was a sickening, disorienting blur of sky and ground. The noise was overwhelming. The receding, agonized scream of the Dakota Queen's engines, the shriek of the wind past his own body. He fought against the centrifugal force, clawing for the D-ring on his chest. His fingers, numb with cold and fear, found it. He pulled. The deployment of the parachute was a violent salvation. With a loud, shocking crack, the silk canopy ripped from its pack and bloomed open above him. The harness jerked him with a force that stole his breath, snapping his body upright. The tumbling stopped. The deafening noise vanished, replaced by an eerie, profound silence. The world, which had been a spinning chaos, suddenly stabilized. He was floating. The silence was the most shocking thing. After the constant, hammering roar of the bomber and the violent exit, the quiet was absolute, almost holy. The only sound was the gentle rustle of the parachute canopy above him. He was suspended in a vast, empty sky. For a few precious seconds, there was a strange, detached peace. He could see the patchwork of fields and forests, the neat lines of roads, the distant specks of villages. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful. But the peace was an illusion, shattered by the return of sound from below. The frantic barking of dogs. The shouts of men. He saw figures running, pointing up at him. He was a slow-moving target, dangling beneath a bright, white canopy. He was no longer a pilot. He was a prey animal. His training kicked in again. He pulled on the risers, spilling air from the chute, trying to steer himself away from a cluster of farmhouses and toward a wooded area he could see a few hundred yards away. The ground rushed up with alarming speed. He remembered the instructions. Feet together, knees bent, roll on impact. The landing was a jarring, brutal return to earth. He hit a plowed field on the edge of the woodline, the force driving the air from his lungs. He collapsed into the soft, damp earth, the parachute settling over him like a shroud. For a moment, he just lay there, gasping, the smell of soil and crushed vegetation filling his nostrils. He was alive. The miracle of that single fact washed over him. He had escaped the fire in the sky. But as he struggled to gather the billowing silk of his parachute, the reality of his situation crashed down upon him with more weight than the landing itself. He was alone. He was behind enemy lines. He was a long, long way from home. The sky had been hell, but he had just landed in another one. The battle for survival was over. The war of evasion had begun. The silence that followed the impact of his landing was profound, broken only by the frantic beating of his own heart and the distant, fading bark of a dog. For a long minute, Rusty Vogelsang did not move, his body pressed into the cold, damp earth of the German field. The shock of the transition was absolute. One moment, he had been a master of a 30-ton fortress, navigating the three-dimensional battlefield of the sky. The next, he was a fugitive, a primitive creature reduced to a single, desperate objective: to remain unseen. The smell of the soil, rich, loamy, and alien, filled his nostrils, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-octane stink of the cockpit. This was the earth of the fatherland, and he was an unwelcome intruder upon it. Training, drilled into him through countless briefings, cut through the haze of adrenaline and fear. "Move. You are a beacon here." He scrambled out of the tangled harness, his fingers fumbling with the cold metal buckles. The bright white silk of the parachute was a flag announcing his position. He gathered it frantically, bundling the cumbersome material into a rough ball, and with a strength born of panic, he half ran, half stumbled the 50 yards to the dark, inviting edge of the forest he had targeted from the air. Once under the canopy of pine and bare-limbed oak, he forced himself to stop, to listen, and to bury the evidence of his arrival. He scraped at the soft forest floor with his hands, digging a shallow grave for the parachute, covering the white silk with dark, wet leaves and loam. It was a pathetic hiding place, he knew, but it was all he had. His next actions were methodical, a checklist of survival. He unzipped his leather flight jacket and tore off the bright yellow silk escape map sewn into the lining. He unfolded it with trembling hands, trying to orient himself. The names were in German, the terrain features abstractions. He knew they had been near Brunswick when they were hit. He had seen a river, a railway line, during his descent. He tried to match the memory to the lines on the map, a futile exercise in disorientation. He then unbuckled the worn .45 caliber pistol from his hip. The cold, heavy weight of it in his hand was both a comfort and a curse. It felt like a toy against the might of the nation he was now trapped within. What was he supposed to do with it? Shoot the first farmer who saw him? Start a one-man war? The absurdity was crushing. He considered ditching it, but the instinct to retain some form of defense was too strong. He shoved it back into its holster, a secret, useless burden. The hunt began in earnest within the hour. He heard them before he saw them, the guttural shouts of men, the excited yapping of more dogs. He pressed himself against the rough bark of a large pine tree, his green flight suit offering meager camouflage against the dark trunk. Through the lattice of branches, he saw them, a group of 4 or 5 Volkssturm, the German home guard. They were old men and young boys, clad in a motley collection of uniforms and civilian clothing, but they carried rifles, and their purpose was deadly serious. They fanned out along the edge of the field he had just vacated, pointing at the disturbed earth where he had landed. One of them, a boy no older than 16, held the lead of a snarling, straining German shepherd. The dog had his scent. This was the moment the abstract concept of evasion became a visceral, physical reality. The fear was no longer a general anxiety. It was a cold, sharp needle in his veins. He held his breath, every muscle tensed. The dog was pulling them directly toward his position. He could hear the men arguing, their voices sharp and excited. He unsnapped the holster of his .45, his hands slick with sweat. His mind raced through the scenarios, all of them ending in his capture or death. Then, a miracle. A sudden, sharp gust of wind rustled the canopy above, and a brief, hard shower of rain began to fall, pattering on the leaves. The dog, confused by the changing air currents and the rain washing away the scent, lost the trail. It circled, whining in frustration. The old man leading the group cursed, shouted a few orders, and they moved off, continuing their search parallel to the woodline, but moving away from him. Rusty remained frozen for a full 10 minutes after the sounds of their search had faded, the rain soaking through his flight suit, the chill seeping into his bones. He had been inches from discovery. The rest of the day was a slow, agonizing crawl westward, guided by a small pocket compass. He moved like a ghost, using the dense undergrowth for cover, freezing at every sound. The crack of a twig, the call of a bird, the distant hum of a vehicle on a country road. The landscape was no longer a scenic view from 25,000 feet. It was a terrifying series of exposed obstacles. Every field was a potential killing zone. Every road was a patrol route. Every farmhouse was an enemy outpost. As dusk began to bleed the color from the world, The reality of his situation solidified into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He was alone, hunted, and utterly lost. The bravado of the bomber crew, the feeling of invincibility high above the flak, was a distant memory. Here, on the ground, he was reduced to his most primitive self. He was hungry, his stomach a hollow ache. He was thirsty, his tongue thick and dry. He was cold, his body shaking uncontrollably in the damp chill of the German night. He found a dense thicket of brambles, a painful but effective hiding place, and curled into a ball, trying to conserve body heat. He thought of his crew, wondering if any had made it out, if they were also hiding in the dark, or if they were already in the hands of the enemy. Above him, through the canopy of leaves, the stars began to appear, the same stars he used to navigate home. But there was no home to navigate to. There was only the darkness, the cold, and the terrifying certainty that with the dawn, the hunt would begin again. He was no longer Lieutenant Alex Vogelsang, pilot. He was a piece of contraband, a fugitive in a land that wanted him dead or in chains. The third day was the worst. The gnawing hunger had graduated to a sharp, constant pain, a hollow void that seemed to consume him from the inside. Thirst was a more immediate torment. His lips were cracked, his throat a dusty passage, every swallow a painful effort. He had risked sipping from a muddy stream, but the fear of illness or discovery made the water taste of panic. The cold of the German spring had seeped deep into his bones, and his shivering was now a near-constant, uncontrollable tremor. His mind, starved of calories and plagued by exhaustion, began to play tricks on him. The shadows between the trees took on human form. The rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth sounded like the footfall of a soldier. He was starting to talk to himself in a low, delirious whisper, a litany of fear and fading hope. His plan, if it could be called that, was simple and desperate. He had to find food. He had observed a small, isolated farmstead on the edge of a wood, a patchwork of fields centered on a weathered timber frame house and a small barn. It looked poorer, more neglected than the others he had seen. There were no signs of a military presence, no flags, no vehicles. It was a calculated risk. Under the cover of a drizzling, gray dusk, he moved from the tree line to the relative cover of a stone wall bordering a field of dormant crops. The approach to the barn was the most exposed. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat signaling his presence to the entire world. Every crunch of gravel under his boot sounded like a gunshot. He slipped through a gap in the barn door, the darkness inside swallowing him whole. The air was thick and warm, smelling sweetly of hay, manure, and animal musk. It was the first comforting smell he had encountered since bailing out. His eyes adjusted to the gloom, revealing the shapes of 2 dairy cows in their stalls. And then he saw it, a small basket of eggs on a shelf, and next to it, a loaf of dark, heavy bread, partially wrapped in a cloth. It was a treasure beyond measure. His hands shook as he grabbed 2 eggs, cracking one open and swallowing the contents raw. It was slimy and cold, but it was sustenance. He shoved the other egg and a hunk of the bread into his pockets, his movements frantic, greedy. He never heard her approach. The barn door creaked open, and a sliver of lantern light cut through the darkness, pinning him where he stood. He froze, a deer in the sights, his hand instinctively moving toward the .45 on his hip. In the doorway stood a woman. She was perhaps in her 50s, her face lined and weathered, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple, worn dress and a thick apron. Her eyes, wide with shock, met his. For a long, terrifying moment, neither moved. Rusty expected the scream, the shouts for help, the arrival of men with guns. But the scream never came. Her eyes darted from his face, pale and smudged with dirt, down to his flight suit, unmistakably American, then to the half-eaten bread in his hand. She saw the desperation, the animal fear. She took a slow step forward, raising a hand not in threat, but in a cautious, calming gesture. "Americaner," she whispered, the word hanging in the dusty air. Rusty could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. He slowly raised his empty hands, showing her he meant no harm. The woman, whose name he would learn was Frau Weber, moved with a quiet, decisive efficiency. She glanced nervously back toward the house, then gestured for him to follow her deeper into the barn, to a hayloft accessed by a rickety ladder. She pointed to a space behind a large stack of hay bales. Here, bleiben sie here. She whispered, stay here. Then she was gone, taking the lantern with her and plunging him back into darkness. The wait that followed was an eternity of renewed terror. Had she gone to get the Gestapo? Was this a trick? He drew his pistol, his finger resting on the cold metal of the trigger guard, preparing for the end. But when the barn door creaked open again, it was only her. She carried a small bundle, a chunk of cheese, a slice of sausage, a full canteen of water. She also held a rough-spun wool blanket. She handed them to him without a word, her eyes constantly flicking toward the door. That first act of kindness was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But the true risk, the profound courage, became clear over the next 2 days. Frau Weber was a war widow. Her 2 sons were both on the Eastern Front. One was already dead, the other missing. She harbored no love for the Nazis, only a deep, abiding resentment for the regime that had taken her family and brought endless war to her doorstep. Helping him was an act of defiance, a way to strike back, but it was also an act of profound humanity. She saw not an enemy airman, but a boy, scared and far from home, not much older than her own sons. She became his sole connection to the world. She brought him food and water under the cover of night. She confirmed his rough location on his escape map with a whispered finger. She told him, in broken English and through gestures, about the patrols, the checkpoints on the main roads. She was a fortress of quiet resistance, her farm his temporary sanctuary. But they both knew it could not last. The search for the downed flyers was still active. It was only a matter of time before someone grew suspicious, before a neighbor noticed something amiss, before a patrol decided to search the isolated barn. On the 3rd night, she came to him with a new intensity in her eyes. She handed him a set of worn, patched civilian clothes, trousers, a coarse shirt, and a jacket that smelled of wood smoke and soil. Sie müssen gehen, she insisted. You must go. She had done what she could. She had fed him, hidden him, and restored a sliver of his strength. But she could not hide him forever. She pointed west on his map, toward a village a day's walk away. There, she whispered, he might find help. There was a church, a priest. She would not, or could not, say more. As he changed out of his flight suit, shedding the identity that made him a target, he felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. This woman, who had every reason to turn him in, had instead saved his life. He tried to thank her, fumbling for the German words. Danke, he whispered. Vielen Dank. She simply nodded, her own eyes glistening in the faint moonlight filtering through the barn slats. She pressed the bundle of food into his hands and gave him one last, long look, a look that held a mother's worry and a comrade's resolve. Then, she pointed toward the back of the barn, to a small door that opened into the woods. Without another word, he slipped out into the cold night, leaving the safety of the hayloft behind. He was no longer just a hunted animal. He was now a link in a fragile, invisible chain. The kindness of a stranger had given him not just food and shelter, but something far more precious, a direction, and the faint, fragile flame of hope. The civilian clothes felt like a poor disguise. The rough-spun wool of the trousers chafed his skin, and the jacket, smelling of a stranger's life, did little to ward off the deep chill of the night. Yet, as Rusty Vogelsang moved away from Frau Weber's farm, he felt a fundamental shift. He was no longer a downed airman in a bright flight suit. He was now a phantom, a shadow blending into the drab tapestry of a war-weary population. His mission was no longer simply to evade, but to navigate. Frau Weber's final, whispered words were a compass point in the darkness. Find the church in the next village. Find the priest. It was a thread of hope, so thin as to be almost invisible, but he clung to it with the desperation of a drowning man. The journey through the night was a study in paranoia. Every sound was amplified. The hoot of an owl was a signal. The distant bark of a dog was an alarm. He avoided roads, instead using his small compass to guide him cross-country. His progress slow and arduous as he stumbled through fields, scrambled over stone walls, and waded through icy streams that numbed his feet to the bone. The landscape itself felt hostile, every farmhouse a potential prison, every lit window a watching eye. He moved from one patch of cover to the next, pausing for long minutes to listen, to watch. his senses stretched to their breaking point. Dawn found him on a wooded hill overlooking the village. It was a small, clustered settlement nestled in a valley, a church spire. His objective, piercing the gray morning sky. He watched for hours, studying the rhythms of the place. He saw farmers heading to their fields, women hanging laundry, a few military vehicles moving on the main road that bisected the village. It was a scene of mundane normality, but to him, it was a fortress he had to penetrate. How could he, a stranger with a terrible accent and a furtive manner, simply walk up to a priest and ask for help? It felt like a suicide mission. He waited until dusk, when the shadows grew long and the activities of the day began to subside. Pulling the collar of his jacket up against the cold and his own anxiety, he slipped into the village, sticking to the narrow, cobbled alleyways between the timber-framed houses. The church was an old, stone building, its walls darkened by centuries of smoke and weather. The heavy oak door groaned as he pushed it open, the sound echoing ominously in the vast, empty silence within. The air was cold and smelled of incense and old stone. At the far end, a single candle flickered on the altar. A figure was kneeling in prayer. Rusty stood frozen just inside the door, his heart pounding. The figure, an older man in a priest's cassock, slowly rose and turned. His face was lined and calm, his eyes sharp and intelligent. They took in Rusty's disheveled appearance, his ill-fitting clothes, the hunted look in his eyes. The priest did not speak. He simply walked toward him, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze unwavering. "Can I help you, my son?" the priest asked in German. His voice was low and steady, devoid of fear or surprise. Rusty's mind went blank. All the practiced phrases fled. In a moment of pure instinct, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his only proof of identity, his blood chit, a small silk flag sewn into his flight gear. It showed an American flag and a message in several languages, offering a reward for his safe return. He held it out, his hand trembling. The priest's eyes moved from the flag to Rusty's face. A profound understanding passed between them. The priest's expression did not change, but a new resolve settled in his eyes. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He gestured for Rusty to follow him, not to the sacristy, but to a small, hidden door behind a tapestry near the confessional. It led to a narrow, winding staircase that descended into a cold, stone cellar. The space was small, filled with old church records and dusty wine barrels. "Wait here," the priest whispered in heavily accented English. "Do not make a sound." The wait in that cellar was a new form of torture. Every footstep from the church above, every creak of the floorboards, sent jolts of terror through him. He was putting his life, and the life of the priest, in the hands of a complete stranger. Hours passed. Then, he heard the hidden door open. It was not the priest. A young man stood there, dressed in the rough clothes of a laborer. He held a finger to his lips, his eyes darting nervously. He gestured for Rusty to follow. This was his introduction to the Underground Railroad, the secret, fragile network of ordinary people who risked everything to defy the Nazi regime. There were no names, no formal introductions. Trust was absolute and given in an instant, for there was no time for anything else. The young laborer led him through a labyrinth of cellars and back alleys, finally delivering him to a safe house, the attic of a schoolteacher. Here, for 2 days, he was hidden, fed, and given new, slightly better-fitting clothes. The teacher and his wife spoke no English, communicating only through gestures and silent kindness. His journey became a series of disconnected, shadowy segments. He was passed from hand to hand, a human parcel of contraband hope. A silent farmer hid him under a blanket in a cartload of hay, transporting him past a military checkpoint, the smell of the hay and the sound of the German soldiers' voices just inches away, forever seared into his memory. A railway worker slipped him into a freight car under the cover of darkness, where he huddled amidst crates of machine parts, the train's lurching motion a terrifying promise of either progress or capture. A brave housewife in a small town hid him in a secret compartment behind a false wall in her pantry, where he listened, heart hammering, as Gestapo officers questioned her in the next room about rumors of resistance activity. It was a journey through a Germany the propaganda films never showed. It was a nation of whispers and fear, but also of immense, quiet courage. He met communists, social democrats, devout Christians, and apolitical people who were simply sick of the war and the tyranny. They were the true secret weapon, an army of shadows whose only weapon was their humanity. They asked for nothing, knowing the price of discovery was a one-way ticket to a concentration camp for themselves and their entire families. With every successful handoff, Rusty's hope grew, but so did the weight of his debt. He was no longer just fighting for his own survival. He was a living testament to the courage of those who helped him, a responsibility that felt heavier than any bomb load he had ever carried. He was walking through hell, but he was being guided by angels. The final leg of the journey was the most surreal. After weeks of moving like a phantom through the dark heart of the Reich, the world began to change. The signs of war became more recent, more raw. The distant thunder of artillery, which had been a constant, ominous rumble for days, now grew into a clear, percussive front. The German military presence thickened, but it had a different character, less of the arrogant, occupying force and more of a desperate, defensive army. The faces of the soldiers were grimmer, the vehicles more battered. For Rusty, huddled in the basement of a bomb-shattered building on the outskirts of a nameless town, the sound of Allied shelling was not a threat. It was the sound of salvation, a symphony of impending liberation. His last contact in the underground network were two brothers, members of a local partisan group. They were no longer just guides. They were scouts at the edge of a battlefield. Their plan was as simple as it was terrifying. The American lines were just beyond the next ridge, a no-man's land of shell craters and burned-out farms. Under the cover of the next artillery barrage, when German attention would be focused on the incoming fire, he was to run. "You will see a ruined church with a broken spire," one of the brothers said, pointing through a crack in the wall. "Head for that. Do not stop. If you see a German, run faster. If you see an American, keep your hands high, very hot." The wait for the barrage was agonizing. The brothers had left him, their duty done. He was alone again, but for the first time, the end was physically visible. He clutched the small, tattered piece of his parachute silk he had kept as a talisman. The sound of the shelling intensified, moving closer, walking its deadly line across the landscape. The building he was in shuddered, dust and plaster raining down on him. This was it. He took a deep breath, thought of the Dakota Queen, of Frau Weber, of the priest, of all the nameless faces who had brought him here, and he ran. He burst out of the ruined building and into a landscape from a nightmare. The earth was a churned-up morass of mud and craters. The skeletal remains of trees smoked against the gray sky. The air screamed with the sound of incoming and outgoing shells. He ran, his legs pumping, his lungs burning, his only focus the broken spire of the church ahead. He stumbled through craters, slipped in the mud, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw German positions, saw helmets turning in his direction, but the chaos of the barrage covered him. A burst of machine gun fire kicked up mud at his feet, but he did not stop. He was a single, desperate figure sprinting through the hell between two armies. Then he saw them. Huddled in a foxhole behind a knocked-out Sherman tank were two American soldiers, their faces grimy and exhausted under their steel pots. He skidded to a halt, his hands shooting into the air so fast he nearly lost his balance. "Don't shoot," he screamed, his voice a ragged, broken thing. "I'm an American. I'm a flyer." The two GIs stared at him, their rifles leveled, their expressions a mixture of shock and suspicion. He was a wild apparition, dressed in a mishmash of filthy civilian clothes, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a frantic light. "What's the score of the '38 World Series?" one of them barked. A standard challenge to root out German spies. Yankees swept the Cubs in 4. Rusty yelled back without hesitation, the trivia drilled into him during escape and evasion training. The tension broke. The soldiers lowered their rifles, one of them letting out a low whistle. "Holy hell! Get in here, you crazy son of a gun." They pulled him into the relative safety of the foxhole. The feeling of being among his own, of hearing the familiar, rough cadence of American English, was so overwhelming he felt dizzy. He was safe. He had made it. What followed was a blur of disbelief and bureaucratic procedure. He was passed back through the lines, from the frontline infantry to a battalion command post, then to a regimental headquarters. The story he told was met with initial skepticism, then growing astonishment. He was deloused, given a proper American uniform. The feel of the wool was like an embrace from home, and subjected to days of intense debriefing by military intelligence. He gave them everything: the names he could remember, the locations of safe houses, the routes he had taken. He described Frau Weber, the priest, the countless others. He was not just a returned airman. He was a priceless intelligence asset, a living map of the German resistance. The final, symbolic return to England was almost an afterthought. He was flown back to a reception center, where the reality of his miracle began to truly sink in. He was put in a room with other returned evaders and escaped POWs. Slowly, he began to piece together the fate of his crew. Ken, his co-pilot, was in a Stalag Luft. Doc, the bombardier, had been captured almost immediately. 2 of the gunners had been killed in the initial attack or the bailout. The Dakota Queen had taken 9 other young men into the sky. Only 5 were known to be alive. The guilt of survival, a familiar specter for any who have endured such ordeals, settled on his shoulders, a heavy, permanent weight. The war was not over for him, but his part in the shooting was. He was sent back to the United States, a returned ghost to a family that had already received a missing-in-action telegram. His homecoming was a storm of tears, laughter, and a profound, unspoken understanding that he was not the same boy who had left. He carried with him the memory of the fire in the sky, the silence of the parachute, the cold fear of the hunt, and the quiet, defiant courage of the strangers in the shadows. He had landed in hell, and through a combination of luck, grit, and the boundless courage of ordinary people, he had walked out alive. He was home, but a part of him would forever be in that German forest, in that hayloft, in that cellar, a silent witness to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a spark of humanity could still light the way home.